Wasabi guys, welcome back to the new year. January 2023, we're going to start it off the 1st of January with 10 underrated commander cards. As always, if you have not, please do subscribe to the channel. A New Year's resolution of mine is to try to make a video every single day this year. I know it's been a while since I made my last underrated commander cards video. That's just the way it is. We have a finite number of magic cards. It gets really difficult to pinpoint exactly what cards I believe to be underrated. So to start it off here, we have the first card, which is an artifact, Lithoform Engine from Zendikar Rising. If you go back to my top 10 Zendikar Rising cards for Commander, I believe this was high up on that list. And you can't really blame me when you read this card, there's just so much text there. You have 3 separate activated abilities that all allow you to copy. You can copy activated or triggered abilities. You could copy instant or sorcery spells. Or you could copy permanents. That last one being pretty substantial, it's harder to copy other permanents if we're talking about making token copies, that is. So why do I think this is underrated? I mean, there are probably people out there who think this is a great card. It's only a few dollars. I think it's been long enough for this to actually be a steal. I think what's holding it back is that we don't really have the same emphasis on activated abilities, especially in the commander format that we used to with something like Mersil. It's been a long time since that commander's released. It may be time for Wizards of the Coast to provide us with a new activated ability commander. It's very interactive. It takes a lot of thinking to work around that kind of deck. But if we got a new one, it would really take a card like Lithoform Engine and turn it into a commander all-star. Right now, I still think it's a pretty solid addition to decks that care about copying instants and sorceries. Maybe if you're a fan of Brutaclad, you would like to get token copies of some creatures that are harder to get token copies of. You are tapping to activate these abilities, which might make it a bit more difficult to actually abuse the card. But even if you're not abusing, these are still pretty solid if you can do this each one of your turns. The next one is Hushbringer from Throne of Eldraine. Hating on your opponent's decks is maybe not the most fun thing, but if you can do it on a budget, I think Hushbringer is a solid addition to a lot of your white decks. Creatures entering the battlefield or dying don't cause abilities to trigger. So it's not just a Torpor Orb, it's not just a Hushwing Gryph. This is also hurting your opponent's death triggers, which makes it doubly attractive. Aristocrats are among the most popular decks played in the Commander format. So hating on the ETB fans and hating on death triggers is going to give you that extra edge, and only 2 mana. It has the fairy thing going for it too. Creature types do matter. It's not that out there to where you wouldn't ever expect it to receive future support. So Hushbringer, a bit of a surprise that it's been this cheap for this long. Next we have Mythos of Snapdax from Ikoria. A lot of the Mythos cards are pretty good value, and that's because they combine being able to play a card for flexible mana, with an added benefit if you are able to add different kinds of mana. What's great about Mythos of Snapdax is that even if you aren't able to get to your black or red mana, which unfortunately in Commander, your Commander's color identity is still going to have to include those two, not just white, you have something that's essentially your Cataclysm. Each player is going to have to select their favorite card out of the card types chosen, and then get rid of the rest. Of course, if you are playing in Marduk colors and you can use all 3 colors of mana, it's even better because you get to choose all of the cards that you keep and all of the ones that your opponents keep. You get to keep your best artifact, your best creature, your best enchantment, and your best planeswalker. And with a political twist, you could even add mercy to the equation. Maybe you're not the arch enemy. Maybe you need an ally in this game. Mythos of Snapdax is a really solid card. Folio of Fancies from Throne of Eldraine. What I love about this is that it's essentially what you would expect out of your typical Nekasar wheel and deal strategy. Players have no maximum hand size. Maybe a downside if you like those strategies because you do also benefit off of them discarding with things like Liliana's Caress. But for the purpose of wheeling and dealing, you want your opponents to draw a ton of cards and you want to deal a lot of damage to them. This also has the benefit of adding to the overall goal of thinning out your opponent's decks and wasting their resources with that second activated ability of 3 mana and tap. Each opponent puts a number of cards equal to the number of cards in their hand from the top of their library into their graveyard. Now you start to see the value of giving each player no maximum hand size. You can abuse that, make them mill out their decks a lot quicker. So for that reason, it would fit in pretty well with any kind of Nekasar strategy that would also potentially benefit off of mill. And even if it doesn't, you have another alternate win con. I love gems like these from older sets where You can totally see the playability, but you can also see why it's a sleeper. You can also see why people have ignored it for so long. Nightmare Shepard from Etherios Beyond Death. This card is pretty ridiculous and it's pretty affordable. Whenever another non-token creature you control dies, you may exile it. If you do, you create a token that's a copy of that creature, except it's a 1/1 and is a nightmare in addition to its other types. So essentially, if you're about ETBs, you're about good death triggers, this is the type of card for you because it's not going to factor in power and toughness as much. That's fine though, because a lot of aristocrat decks are not just about dealing combat damage, so make my creatures 1/1s all day long doesn't really hurt me. I love cards like these that give a second life to a lot of your other creatures. In a similar sense to Ratadrabic from Dominaria United, it does have the downside of making it a very specific thing, but you still ultimately get that creature back for its abilities. It's also a demon, again I said this with Hushbringer, creature types matter, a very solid demon for what it is for only 4 mana. Next we have Gravebreaker Lamia, also from Etherios Beyond Death, a very solid set. This time you get a black card that's very focused on the graveyard. We get another one of those, go figure. This wouldn't be so impressive if all we got here was just an entomb on a 5 mana creature that isn't instant speed. You know, it doesn't have flash, we don't have that kind of advantage, but what we have here is spells you cast from your graveyard cost 1 less to cast. This is going to be pretty underrated in the future because we're only going to get more strategies that add on to aspects of the game that already exist. You have so many different ways of casting creatures from your graveyard, casting instants and sorceries from your graveyard, casting a lot of different card types from your graveyard. Anything that alleviates that cost, makes it less painful, is going to help your deck significantly. It's also an enchantment creature, which might matter if you are an enchantment-focused deck that also cares about the graveyard. Nothing on the list is going to be super expensive. Again, this is why I think a lot of cards are underrated, being cheap and also playable. It's not that I think any of these are all-stars, but they most certainly have value to offer your commander decks. Next up is Ox of Agonis, another card from Etherios Beyond Death. This 5 mana red mythic Ox says when it enters the battlefield, you discard your hand, then draw 3 cards. That's really what I want to advertise here, it's nothing else. I'm not going to talk about the rest of the card because while it's okay, while it's going to add value to the experience with it, just simply being able to discard your hand in red and then draw 3 cards is awesome because what happens in red all the time? You get down to less than 3 cards in your hand, so this is going to be better than a lot of your current card draw in red. We get a lot of instant speed card draw where you're usually just looting, you're not gaining any card advantage. Ox of Agonis is going to get you pretty far, especially if you can abuse that ETB. How you abuse it is pretty simple. You play the cards you like, you ditch the ones you don't, you get a new 3 cards. Now on to the rest of the card. The escape cost is awesome, because built in you already have a way of filling your graveyard off of that discard. You only pay 2 red and exile 8 other cards from your graveyard that probably weren't useful to you in red. So that's a way of bringing it back from the graveyard. It does get an additional +1/+1 counter, but that's not really the impressive thing here. The impressive thing is that you're constantly getting more card draw in red that you don't necessarily have to give up much for. Next we have Kogla the Titan Ape from Ikoria. What can we say about Ikoria? Just a crazy set, a lot of different over-the-top creatures, over-the-top abilities, and Kogla is not really one of them. However, Kogla is pretty solid if all you're looking for is a solid green creature. Commander is a format where we see a lot of power creep, so anything that's 6 mana, it's gotta pull its weight, I understand that. But this is a multifaceted green creature. It enters the battlefield, it pulls its weight. You get to fight up to 1 target creature you don't control. That's 7 power doing that, by the way. Whenever Kogla attacks, you destroy target artifact or enchantment defending player controls. That's always been a pretty powerful trigger. And for 2 mana, you kinda have a way of protecting him. You return target human you control to its owner's hand to have it gain indestructible until end of turn. Maybe the least useful of these abilities if all you're focused on is adding it to an average green deck, but the possibilities of just including this in any commander deck where your commander happens to be human is also useful when it comes to protecting that commander. Let's say there's a board wipe that destroys all creatures. Instead of having to replay that human commander with a commander tax, you could bounce it back to your hand, Kogla gains indestructible so he survives that board wipe, and all you have to do is just replay the human commander for its normal cost. Not even mentioning the fact that Kogla can be a commander itself. Again, none of these are over the top all-stars, but they're just solid cards that serve their purpose within the color, and it's what you would expect out of these colors. Next, we have Linvala, Shield of Seagate from Zendikar Rising. If you love Selfless Spirit, if you can see why that card would be annoying, Linvala is basically the more color-specific version of that, where instead of just being able to include her into any white deck, you have to do that plus blue. What you get in return is the addition of maybe choosing Hexproof for all of your creatures instead of just Indestructible. This makes a massive difference because a lot of removal can get around Indestructible, and sometimes you don't have to contend with a board wipe that destroys all of your creatures. Sometimes it's a targeting removal spell that is meant to get rid of your most important creature, so Linvala is extra useful in that aspect. Every other way that a card like Selfless Spirit would be annoying still applies to Linvala. 3-mana creatures are pretty easy to bring back from the graveyard. Doing this is going to make it really difficult for your opponents to deal with your creatures. And the last underrated card for today is Etherios Shroud Veiled. Another card from Theros Beyond Death, but this time it's the Buy a Box promo. You might be paying a slight premium for that, but believe me, it's well worth it because this is a decent card that more people should be playing in aristocrat-focused decks. Why? Because it helps alleviate one of the biggest problems for those aristocrat decks, and that's anything that can send a creature to exile. We have so many replacement effects now that interrupt a creature going to the graveyard, and instead it sends them to exile. Etherios doesn't really care if a creature dies, it has to either die and go to the graveyard, or get exiled. Doing that is going to be enough to get the trigger. So long as it has that coin counter on it to begin with, you're going to get that creature back to the battlefield under your control. The kicker here, the added benefit, which you needed something a little bit extra for the 6 mana you're spending, is that you can put coin counters on your opponent's creatures. So you can build your deck entirely around removal, intending to steal your opponent's creatures away, which does add an extra layer to the original Etherios formula where it was about getting your creatures back. This one is more focused on creatures in general. This one is maybe slower paced, but you have that option available. As is the case with pretty much any other god, they're solid creatures, they sit out there on the field. If you get the Devotion, you get a 4/7 Indestructible that is going to block for you all day. Maybe not the most threatening force on offense, but the sum of everything you see here is a very solid black and white aristocrat-focused creature. That could also be a decent commander option. That's going to do it for these 10 underrated commander cards. Let me know what you think about them in the comments section below. Also, let me know some of your New Year's resolutions. Commander Void here signing off. I will see you all next time.